Hello everyone, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today for another installment of the research webinar series hosted by our team here at the Michigan Virtual Learning Research Institute, or MVLRI. The goal of MVLRI is to expand Michigan's capacity to support new learning models, engage in active research to inform new policies in online and blended learning, and strengthen the state's infrastructures for sharing best practices. MVLRI is a division of MVU, or the Michigan Virtual University, a nonprofit organization whose mission is advancing K-12 education through digital learning, research, innovation, policy, and partnerships. MVU is also the parent company of Michigan Virtual School, a supplemental state-sponsored virtual school, Michigan LearnPort, an online professional development portal for K-12 educators and personnel, and MyBlend, a blended learning initiative providing K-12 schools with resources, products, and services to personalize learning options for their students and improve student achievement. A quick disclaimer before we begin today's webinar. This webinar will be recorded and shared publicly. Consequently, anything shared during this webinar, including chat comments, could be shared publicly. This webinar may represent a presenter's or an attendee's personal views, opinions, conclusions, and other information which do not necessarily reflect those of MVU and/or the Michigan Virtual Learning Research Institute and are not given nor endorsed by MVU/MVLRI unless otherwise specified. Today we'll be hearing from Dr. Joe Friedoff, the Executive Director of MVLRI, who will be sharing with us some highlights from Michigan's K-12 Virtual Learning Effectiveness Report for 2013-2014. Dr. Friedoff has been with MVU since 2009. He earned his PhD in Educational Technologies from Michigan State University and specializes in data-driven decision-making, analysis of student and teacher performance, course evaluation, and data optimization. He also has experience teaching in face-to-face and online settings, having taught undergraduate and graduate level courses in both face-to-face and online formats. Before returning to school for his PhD, Dr. Friedoff taught high school English in the state of Michigan. With that, I'll hand it over to Dr. Joe Friedoff.
Thank you, Justin. So I'm very happy to be able to have an opportunity to talk about the effectiveness report that we just recently released. This is a requirement that the legislature gives the Michigan Virtual Learning Research Institute on each year, and you can see the language in the statute on the screen. Specifically, we're kind of looking at three things, looking at enrollment totals, completion rates, and overall impact on pupils in the given year. The data that we have comes from multiple sources that are collected at the state level. You see a list of them here. Some of them is information we'll give back to the state, but most of it is reported from the public school systems directly back to the state. And none is more important than this teacher-student data link system, which I'll talk about in a minute. I think it's important to be aware, though, that there's going to be reporting errors due to the self-reported nature of some of the data that's collected. So while that's the case, it still represents the most comprehensive collection of information on K-12 virtual learning in Michigan. To start out with, I think it's helpful for us to kind of get some similar terminology. And so we started with the Michigan K-12 student population, and we basically separated them into two groups. There were students who we called virtual learners because they had taken one or more virtual courses, and there were students who were non-virtual learners. By definition, of course, the non-virtual learners, the only type of course they took were non-virtual, at least in the 2013-14 school year. In contrast, the virtual learners had to have taken at least one virtual course, and many of them took non-virtual courses, with the exception of students who were in cyber or full-time online programs. And then furthermore, we took the virtual courses and we looked at three different subsets of those. Cybers, or students, again, who were enrolled at a full-time online school in the state. The Michigan Virtual School, which is a state-supported supplemental program. And then the third category is anyone that didn't fall into that cyber or the MVS. This is what we call the local solution. It's what the public school was doing to provide online courses for their students. As I said before, the rich source for our data collection was what's called the Student Teacher Data Link System, or the TSDL system. And what you see on the screen is an image of the interface that schools use to put this information or share this information with the state. I've highlighted in yellow some of the key fields, but just looking at it, you'll see that the subject area code and course identifier codes, these align with the National Center for Educational Statistics, SCED, or School Common Exchange of Data codes. And that really is helpful for us to not only compare across districts in the state of Michigan, but many other states can use those same codes as they're nationally recognized, and it allows for comparison across states. The completion status field, we'll get into that a little bit more later, but that was one of the measures we used for performance. And then, of course, the virtual delivery, which is this yes/no, was a flag that we looked at to determine whether the course should be counted as a virtual enrollment. It's not really that easy, and we're very particular about the use of the term virtual courses or virtual delivery in this report. This is the definition you see on screen that the schools are given when asked to report was the course delivered virtually, and as you look at it, it has some slipperiness. It could be virtual learning, online learning, or computer courses, distance learning, or self-scheduled virtual learning. And so it may very well include courses that are above and beyond what most of us would consider or refer to as an online course. And so please keep that in mind, and that's why you'll hear us talk about it in the framework of virtual learning as opposed to online learning. When we looked at trying to identify which courses were virtual, I showed you that virtual delivery flag, and for the most part, 90% of the enrollments came because that virtual delivery flag was set to yes. But there are other reasons that we incorporated enrollments to call them as being delivered virtually. And some of those or all of those used strategies that looked at that local course title. So we said if there were some keywords that were appearing in the title, such as Michigan Virtual School, but the flag was not set to yes or true, then we would recode that and call it a virtual enrollment. So we did that with various references to the Michigan Virtual School, which accounted for about 1% of the enrollments. We did it for local title and third-party vendors, so we knew a lot of national providers, E2020, Aventa, Apex, these kinds of names, and we looked for those in the local course title as examples of ones, and that was about 6% of the data. And then we looked for some generic, does it reference just online learning, virtual learning, something like that, and those represented about an additional 3%. And finally, just to give you an idea of how much noise or difficulty this is, we had to recode 831 enrollments from a cyber school. We did this by calling MDE up, and MDE checked on our behalf with that cyber school, and yes, they were erroneously flagged. But it just gives you an idea that even people who work 100% of the time in the cyber or fully online environment don't always put the data, enter the data properly into the system. So clearly there is some noise. I'm sure we included some enrollments that shouldn't. I'm sure there are virtual enrollments that ought to be included that aren't in our sample. So I think a good way, kind of the final caveat before we move too much farther, is to think about that what schools were calling a course varied fairly considerably. Okay, some schools were probably more along a Carnegie unit, kids taking 12, maybe 18 courses if they were on a trimester, and some were way higher. What I would describe probably more likely what they were counting or reporting as a course was what most of us would call maybe a unit or a lesson. And so there is some variation, and you can see how those occur. But for the most part, when we looked at how that variation impacted, it inflated the enrollment numbers a bit perhaps, but when we controlled for that and still looked at the completion pass rates, it really didn't have any impact on the completed pass rates that we're going to share. So without further ado, let's talk about what the data tell us. The first thing we looked at was how many students were learning virtually in the state of Michigan in the 2013-14 year, and what we found is that number exceeded 76,000 virtual learners, or students who took at least one course online K-12. That number is up almost 21,000 students compared to the previous year, or up 38%. If you look at the percentages, clearly the highest percentage ones of growth are in K6, K7 maybe, with much lower growth rates in 9-12, but the numbers were much smaller in those K6 or K7 compared to the high school. So the high school is the one that have all the, thousands of students growth. So not anything that's surprising, but it'll be interesting to see how the K6 continues to grow over time. I think one of the areas that would surprise most lay people about the data, we hear a lot of the conversation when people think about virtual learners, they think, students from cyber schools. But when you look at the data in the state of Michigan, only 12% of the virtual learners were enrolled through cyber schools. Only 10% were from the state supplemental program, Michigan Virtual School. The vast majority of the data in in the 12-13 14 data set here were students who attend a local building, they attend their local public school, and sometime along their coursework in the 13-14 year, they took one or more courses through whatever providers their local uses. So 78%, almost 4 out of 5, are at that local level. Eric, others like Event E2020 classified, well, it depends. If they were being used by a cyber provider, they would be in cyber. If they were being used by an MVS product, they would be in MVS. They're not really specific to who was providing them besides the classification of cyber versus MVS versus local. Okay, so we looked at students, and the next thing we looked at was the enrollments themselves. And again, we found really large growth here. In 12-13, it was 185,000. This last year, it was above 319,000, or over 134,000 more enrollments this year from last. And even when we control for the different methodology that helped us identify, roughly 10% more enrollments than the methods from last year, you still see a really sizable jump in the number of virtual enrollments. In fact, while it is sizable, it still only represents about 1.9% of all the enrollments K-12 in the state of Michigan for that time frame. Again, you'll see the largest percentage of growth at K6. Same reason about those low numbers, but again, the bulk of the numbers of enrollments happening at the high school level. No surprise here that you see a little bit of a shift. Remember, the cybers were considerably lower, but now when it factors in enrollments, they're about a quarter of the enrollments were from cyber schools. MVS dropped from 10 to 5%, but the locals still remain quite high. 68%, or the majority of the enrollments, are what's coming from those local programs. Using that subject area code, we tried to find out, where are students going, and this was something we looked at in the previous year, and the results were pretty consistent. They tend to be in the core subject areas, English being pretty heavy and mathematics being the rest. The other subject areas are only 20% of the data. But in this year's report, we drilled down even further. So we tried to say, well, if they're taking mathematics courses, which mathematics courses? Or if they're taking English, which English courses? Are they taking electives? Or are they taking more core? And it was clear in the report that the more prevalent courses are the ones that kids have to take in order to graduate high school. They're not necessarily taking enrollment in elective courses too much. So you see here in English and math, we have the top 5 titles and the numbers and percentage of those. In mathematics, in fact, there are 2 other Algebra 1 variations in the top 10. So if you rolled those 3 together, they would clearly be the #1 mathematics course title. Here's an example from life and physical sciences and social sciences as well. And finally, we had information about the enrollment in AP courses. We only found a little over 1,600 virtual enrollments in AP courses, which we think is probably an underreporting that's currently happening. The numbers are surprising given what we know MVS does in and of itself, but also that Michigan is, again, one of those states where the number of AP titles offered face-to-face in high schools are pretty low, considering. What we found in the 2013-14 year, just like in 2012 and the previous years, is that if schools had any virtual enrollments, they were most likely to have 100 or more for the year. Almost half of the schools with virtual enrollments had 100 or more enrollments, and 9% increase over the previous year. And while that said, the second most likely grouping was that they had less than 10. So we see this really heavy user or light user phenomenon, and it stays really consistent over the years that the data have been collected. The first data year was 2010-11, and as you see, the N, or the number of schools in that year, were 654. We've grown to over 1,000 schools in the state of Michigan reporting virtual learning, and yet the pattern or the trend seems pretty consistent over the 4-year span. While enrollment counts provide an important glimpse into virtual learning in the state of Michigan, of even greater interest to many is how they perform in their courses. And one of the measures that we use to look at that student performance in virtual courses is that completion status. When schools report enrollment information to the state, one of the data components submitted is this field. And to give you an example of some of the statuses schools can pick from, it would be things like audited, completed passed, completed failed, withdrawn exited, just to name a few. So there's a few things to keep in mind before we get into really looking at these completed pass rates. A course completion is not synonymous with passing a course. As I kind of noted, schools currently differentiate when reporting to the state those enrollments that were completed but failed, which they can use the status of completed failed, from those that were completed and passed, the status of completed pass. Thus, completion as it is traditionally used by schools when reporting data to the state conveys the meaning of finished or remained enrolled throughout the course time frame and doesn't signify whether the student earned a passing grade in the course for which the credit was granted. Enrollments with the completion status of audited existed where students enrolled in the course without expecting or receiving credit. Because there was no performance expectation for such instances, it may be prudent not to include the impact of audits on performance calculations. However, for transparency purposes and to allow you as attendees of this webinar or readers of our report to make their own determinations, we included the audited enrollments in our calculations. Just understand that the effect of doing so lowers the percentage of enrollments that were completed passed. So too, the guidelines for marking enrollment as incomplete specify that students who didn't have a final grade in the course by August 27th of 2014 were to be given an incomplete grade. As the data show, as you'll see, that virtual learners had higher rates of enrollments with completion statuses of incomplete. Likely many of these enrollments reflect students who took summer courses virtually. Like the inclusion of audits, this impact of us including those in the calculation is again going to lower the percentage of enrollments that were completed and passed. It's unclear how to best treat enrollments with a withdrawn status. And in the state, you can have 3 different withdrawn exited, withdrawn passing, withdrawn failing. For instance, 3% of the virtual enrollments in 2013-14 were marked as withdrawn passing, which meant that the student was passing at the time they withdrew. And, as a research team, we ask questions such as, should these enrollments be counted as failures and included in the comp rate formula? What about students whose enrollments were marked as withdrawn exited? There's no way to determine whether that exited occurred in the first few weeks of course or in the final weeks, and the data don't tell us or provide insight into whether the student was re-enrolled into a different course or whether it was too late for a re-enrollment in a credit-bearing opportunity. We left them in the completion rate again for transparency purposes, but once again, the impact of doing so will be to lower the completed pass rates in those areas. And finally, as a proxy for this passing rate, many of the upcoming slides are going to emphasize the percentage of enrollments that ended with a completion status of completed pass. There are no reporting guidelines, though, as to what counts as passing. It's likely best to assume that passing requirements differ among schools. Some may say that it's fine at 60%, others may choose a higher threshold. For all of those things, I think it's important caveats to keep in mind when we look at this completion rate data, but let's dig into it a bit. So here's what we found. When we started with the non-virtual learners, or those who did not take a single course virtually in 2013-14, their average completed pass rate was 89%. So this is really helpful because it provides a benchmark to compare how virtual learners did in their non-virtual courses. Since if you remember the few slides ago, most of those students also took traditional courses. So presumably, if the virtual learners were the same as the non-virtual learners in terms of course performance, then the completed pass rates for both those groups should be about 89%. Only it wasn't. It was 71%. So this sizable drop-off suggests to us that the virtual learners on average are not performing as well in their traditional brick-and-mortar schools as do the non-virtual learners. If we use that 71 as a benchmark for how well virtual learners do in their non-virtual courses, then the 57% completed pass rate for these students in their virtual courses suggests that the performance is even lower in their virtual courses on average than it is in their non-virtual courses, which has kind of led to the lay result of how news outlets have been portraying, that students are underperforming, that are struggling in their virtual courses, and it's this kind of narrative, 89, 71, 57. But it's a much more complex storyline than that. For instance, as I mentioned before about the effect of the incompletes, the 57% is likely to be a bit higher than that 57% because that 8% is going to clear itself up likely when the final data comes. It won't be enough to close the gap between the 71 and the 57, and it probably won't change the overall conclusion that the lower percentages of students are passing their virtual courses, but it's just another example of how things will change. We saw tremendous variation on this pass rate on a variety of levels, so we'll talk about a few of them right now. One of them was about the virtual subset. So remember, we looked at students from cyber schools, we looked at students who took courses with the Michigan Virtual School, and we lumped the rest of them together as what the local solution was. And what you see here in this chart, if we take the Michigan Virtual School as an example, its students were still below average. In their traditional courses, they passed those courses 86% of the time compared to the non-virtual average of 89, but when their students took the courses virtually, that performance dropped to 72%. That's quite a higher displacement than we see with the local or the cyber. So for instance, in the local situation, you see that they were only passing their non-virtual courses 69% of the time and only 57% when they went online. And the cybers is a bit of a ringer here. We tried to create a comparison group for them by saying if they ever attended a cyber and had virtual enrollments, but at some point they had non-virtual enrollments, we counted the non-virtual in that comparison group. And I think why you see the 51% in the cybers as being so low is easily attributed to the withdrawn exited. And so likely the explanation here is that you had students who started in a traditional school in the fall. At some point during the fall, they transferred into a cyber school. That local school marked them then as having exited the school, which brought down that completed pass rate. If I had to guess, my assumption is that it would look closer to that 69% or somewhere in that non-virtual space of what we would see for a pattern. But again, we don't know. But we can clearly see that different kinds of students are being directed to these different types of virtual learning, and is probably impacting them in specific ways. 51% of schools with virtual enrollments in 2013-14 had school-wide completed pass rates of 70% or better. Again, this is a good mark for us because that 71% is what the average virtual learner was doing when they were in their brick-and-mortar building. Clearly, some schools are implementing models that are working better than others. It's not exactly clear what specifically differs between successful and unsuccessful schools, but likely factors include the quality of the course content, the skill of the online instructor, if there even is one within a course, the readiness of students selected for virtual learning, and the wraparound supports schools use to nurture their virtual learners. Again, notice how this trend has been pretty consistent from one year to the next despite that growth in the number of school entities. This was a new analysis we did in this year's report. It's actually one of my favorite ones to look at. The idea of some schools doing really well or really poorly is mirrored when we look at students. This chart looks at virtual learners from the Michigan Virtual School and the local virtual subsets, so it doesn't include the cybers. And these subsets typically represent virtual learners who take some of their courses virtually and some non-virtually. And what we see in this chart is that about 65% of the virtual learners pass their course when they take only one virtual course. So the far left, about 2/3 pass, 1/3 failed it. The 57% were able to pass both their courses when they take two, and roughly 30% failed both. So you can think of these two lines as being perfect success or perfect failure. And the conclusion that you see here is the blue line is telling us that somewhere roughly around 30% or more of students who take virtual courses in a supplementary context will pass every single one you give them. But the flip side of that is that there still remains 30 to 20, somewhere in there, depending on how many, number of students or percent of students who will not pass a single course that they are given, no matter if you give them 1 or 12. And part of the interesting question then is, why are students in supplementary contexts getting 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 courses without having had any prior success in online learning? But that threshold right there, that 30 to 20% of students who will never pass or have never passed a course in the 13-14 school year, is probably a large part of why we see the depressed rates in student performance. This chart provides another way that we can kind of see this issue, and this time it includes data on virtual learners from MVS and local subsets that neither passed all nor failed all. So all of those students are in this averaging. And what you see on average is that students who had the highest completed pass rates in their virtual courses when they took 1 to 2 in a year, which we categorized as low use, and students who took 5 or more virtual courses in a year as a supplementary condition, or what we categorized as high use, they tended to have the lower completed pass rates. And again, this trend has been really consistent over the last 4 years in the state of Michigan. While the completed pass rates didn't differ much by gender, the data indicate that students who were identified as living in poverty did not perform as well as their non-poverty peers. In the 2013-14 data, 64% of the virtual enrollments from students not flagged as living in poverty achieved the completion status of completed pass, whereas only 53% of students in poverty achieved that same status. This discrepancy suggests that there remains much to do to realize the potential of virtual learning to reduce the effects of poverty on learning outcomes. However, the gap for virtual learners in their non-virtual courses was even larger. Virtual learners in poverty had a 14% lower completed pass rate in their non-virtual courses than virtual learners who were not in poverty. Non-virtual learners also showed a drop of 9% for students living in poverty. Seat time waiver is a term that we use in the state of Michigan that basically lifts the requirement for them to physically be in attendance at the school facility, and or it lifts the cap on the number of enrollments that student can take. Typically the requirement is if they're going to take more than 2 virtual courses away from the school building, they have to have one of these waivers, and then the child is considered to be a seat time waiver student. What we saw here is that 55% of virtual enrollments from seat time waiver students in the 2013-14 school year yielded a completion status of completed pass, compared to 58% from non-seat time waiver students. This gap closed over the 13-14 school, over what we saw in the previous year. And the closing of the gap occurred really because it moved from both ends. You see the non-seat time waiver performance dropped. You saw the seat time waiver performance increase. And I think it will be important to keep this in mind when we look at some of the other performance data coming up. So while the completion status data provide us one glimpse into understanding virtual learning, we also have the Michigan Merit Exam. It's the state standardized test that Michigan uses, and we also had ACT, which is a better national benchmark, as external measures that we could look at. What you see in this table is the percentage of virtual learners who tested proficient on various subjects on the 2014 MME, an annual exam administered to high school juniors in the spring, and it compares those percentages to the statewide averages for all Michigan juniors. For each MME subject, the percentage of virtual learners testing proficient was below the state average by 10% or more. Writing had the largest difference, with virtual learners 16.8% below the state average, and science had the smallest difference at 10.3%. The ACT data paint a similar picture. The table here shows the percentage of virtual learners who met or exceeded the ACT college readiness benchmarks on the various subjects of the ACT and compares those percentages to the statewide averages for all students. Again, each subject showed a lower percentage of virtual learners reaching the benchmark compared to the state average. English had the largest difference, with virtual learners 16.6% below the state average, and science had the smallest difference at 3.5%. Despite clear differences between virtual learners and the average Michigan student, the data don't tell us what accounts for the underperformance or even what impact the virtual learning aspects of virtual enrollments play in these data. Consider, for instance, that some virtual learners only took a single virtual course for the year, and some not even in the subject tested, whereas others took several virtual courses in the year, and even multiple in the subject tested. Some had taken virtual courses in previous years, and others took their first virtual course this year. So looking at this data, it's a little bit difficult to draw exact conclusions, but clearly the data and the trend is not something that we should be proud of. Some students were seat time waiver students, whereas others were not. Here we see how seat time waiver students perform compared to non-seat time waiver students. So if you recall a few slides ago, I mentioned, the gap was only 3% in terms of completed pass. We see much different outcomes here on the ACT. In all ACT subjects, the percentage of non-seat time waiver students who met or exceeded the ACT college readiness benchmark was about 10% or more are higher than it was for seat time waiver students. And the percentage of students who met or exceeded the ACT college readiness in all 4 subjects was 8.5% lower for seat time waivers than it was for non-seat time waiver students. So while we might look at that screen from a few slides ago and say, hey, the performance gap is closing a bit and maybe students are recovering credit more often, this is suggesting potentially that while they're recovering credit, they may not be recovering content. While there's clear variation for virtual learners based on that seat time waiver status, the biggest differences we saw were based on poverty status. And here we see how virtual learners in poverty performed compared to virtual learners not in poverty. In all the subjects, the percentage of virtual learners not in poverty who met or exceeded the ACT college readiness benchmark was 20% higher or more than it was for virtual learners in poverty. The percentage of virtual learners who met or exceeded all 4 was 16.1% lower for virtual learners in poverty than it was for those who weren't. And, I was asked in one of the interviews recently to kind of talk about the poverty situation, because one of the things we see is that a large number, proportionate of the online enrollments or the virtual enrollments were from students in poverty compared to the state average. And the question was, well, why do you see that? And we have a different report on our website that looked at a survey of 800 Michigan adults. And we did a random phone survey with them. We stratified it so that it represented the state. And we asked a variety of awareness and attitude questions. And for the purposes of this point right now, one of the things we found strongly is that income level and education level were very strongly connected to people's beliefs about the importance of online learning. So just to give you a couple of examples, the people who made less than $25,000 in a year were much more optimistic and were much more in agreement with students having choice to take online courses compared to people who made more than $100,000. So very different attitudes about the need for students to be able to have a choice to take virtual courses based on the amount of money they made. That same kind of pattern was related to education. So people who had were less than a high school degree, much more optimistic, much more interested in having choice for students in the virtual space compared to those who had postgraduate degrees. Age was another factor that we saw in that space that impacted. And so one of the things I suggested was that we probably have a couple of factors going on. We saw that 89 to 71% drop. I think one of the pieces that we have is a mindset issue in the field right now about who is a good candidate for online learning. And it probably is more the situation when something goes wrong. And so we're seeing students who are not being as successful as the average student in their school building, who are then being seen as prime candidates for virtual learning. And if we use that state level data, we might say that their parents or their advocacy efforts are more receptive. Those parents may be more receptive to the idea of having their kids put into virtual courses or be advocating for their students to be put into virtual courses. So I think this is one of those spaces where the rhetoric of online is not necessarily living up to, at least in the state of Michigan, its ideal goal. Hopefully online learning is something that can bring high quality instruction to students wherever they are. And so for me, this was one of the more disheartening findings of the report. That said, again, we saw really significant differences based on the virtual subset. So if we take these three things, here's one of the ways to look at it. The Michigan Virtual School always exceeded the statewide average, and it did so by large margins. So one of the things we can say is, again, MVS's students, when they took non-MVS courses, passed 86% of the time, which suggests that they were slightly below or very close to the state average in terms of students. And yet, when they perform on their ACT, on their subjects here, they're well performing above and beyond what the state average is. The locals and the cybers are performing consistently below what the state average is. And I want to be clear here. Given other aspects of this report, it seems likely that the performance differences are attributed to the kinds of students who are provided opportunities or who choose between these different virtual options, the readiness of students for virtual learning, the entry-level subject proficiency or lack thereof with which students begin their virtual courses, the reasons the student take the course virtually as opposed to in a traditional mode, if that option even existed for the student, and even the local support or family supports available to virtual learners. Whatever this combination of best practices and factors is, though, the bottom line is that, at least in the state of Michigan, too many students are not being adequately educated through existing virtual learning options. As a percentage of overall enrollments, virtual enrollments represented about 2% or 1.9% of the enrollments in the state for 2013-14, which was up about 8% over the previous year. And this pattern of continued growth, it has been trending up, and what you see right here is a kind of a density map based on our intermediate school districts in the state of Michigan. These are like BOCES or things in other states. About a quarter of the enrollments in the state came from those seat time waiver students, as we see here. And it is down a little bit compared to the previous year, and it's really an interesting challenge that we're going to face, I think, from a policy perspective, because the performance still is not ideal. I know our current governor is really interested in students moving farther and faster, and yet I think the practice at present is more for trying to find students who are using this as very special circumstances or because it's an option of last resort. But we'll see how this continues to play out politically over the next handful of coming years. Finally, the number of educational entities that had students who took virtual courses last year continued to grow. I kind of mentioned this in some of the other slides. We went from about 654 in the 2010-11 school year. We're up over 1,000 entities in 2013-14. I'm sure if you look at these percentages, it would be higher if you broke it down into high school versus, elementary or middle school, but generally speaking, the trend is becoming more and more popular for schools to have at least one virtual learner in the state. So with that, that should provide a pretty good overview of the data that's in Michigan's K-12 Virtual Learning Effectiveness Report for 2013-14. Very happy to take some questions now. Thank you, Lori.
Hi, Joe. It's Justin.
Mm-hmm.
Can you talk maybe a little bit about how you foresee some of the data collection processes being different for future iterations of the report, where we might be able to see some different layers of the reporting there and maybe some different insights from the data we collect?
Yeah, sure. So, every year the state has to put back out, what's going to be collected, and in the state of Michigan, probably like other states, this is wrapped in politics and lawsuits. In the state of Michigan, one of the big things is unfunded mandates. There's the challenge about collecting data that isn't specifically where schools aren't specifically funded to do so. So that becomes an issue that we hear from time to time. But for the most part, if it's in the legislation, if it's the schools are provided funding as part of their per pupil allowance or their foundation funding, and this reporting is seen as part of that, they're covered. What happens then is we see some slight variation from a field from one year to the next. So to give you an example, the virtual delivery field that we used in this year's report was a dichotomous variable. It was either yes or it was no. And in next year's report, they moved to changing that to be one of 4 statuses, I believe. One of which is that it was not, there was no virtual status. One was blended learning, and they have a definition of blended. They have one what they call digital learning, which, for lack of a better term, I think if you read the definition, it would be more of the equivalent of like online learning without an online teacher. So more maybe like a software as a solution kind of product. And then the 4th category is online learning with an instructor, what we would think of as being, a typical best practice program where there's a highly qualified Michigan certified teacher who provides instruction through the online environment. So that has been, diversified. I'd like to think, and maybe it's just wishful thinking, but the report has gotten quite a bit of publicity through various media outlets or through other presentations that we've given over the past year and will continue to give in this year. And I'm optimistic that the quality of the data that we're going to receive over the coming years is going to improve because schools know it's going to some good benefit. I mean, we're taking the data that they're being required to put in, and we're trying to repackage it and make it intelligent and give it back to them in ways that they can be better consumers of it. And so for that reason, I hope that it will cause people to think more critically about how they're capturing their data in their system so that they can get better information back about how their students and how Michigan is in this space to begin with. So Eric, your question is about the difference between the MVS students and the local students. Here's what happened in how we coded the students. If a student had ever taken a Michigan Virtual School course in the 13-14 year, then we claimed every virtual enrollment from that student as being attributable to the Michigan Virtual School. And I know that is going to be false in some cases, but we didn't have a better way of being able to go about it. So we aggregated them all at the student level, which means there'll be some that were some other vendor, but they were the Michigan Virtual School. So that's how those work. There wouldn't be anyone in the local subset that actually had taken a course from the Michigan Virtual School in the 13-14. Otherwise, they would be in the MVS subset and not the local. Becky asks, are we able to see how many virtual students living in poverty are taking core courses for credit recovery? So here's, and Justin asked about data collection efforts. One of the things that I really like that we collect as part of the Michigan Virtual School enrollment process is the reason the child is taking the virtual course. So when this happens in MVS, we ask them to choose between one of 5 conditions. It was because the course was unavailable locally. It was because of scheduling conflict. It was the learner preference of the student. It was credit recovery, or it was other. And what we have found is that this has been a really good data collection, because the performance is very different in the MVS courses depending on which reason they're coming to. In our legislative report, which we release every December, it kind of profiles the performance of the Michigan Virtual School. There's a table in there. I don't know if Catherine or Justin could share a link to that legislative report. But there's a table in there that breaks down the student performance based on the reason they come. And probably any of you could guess that the students who come for scheduling conflict or come because the course was unavailable locally considerably outperform the students who come because of credit recovery. But the state of Michigan as a whole does not ask schools to provide why they're enrolling the child in the virtual course. So it's not data that we have at the state level. So Catherine states, last year's effectiveness report reflected on the importance of mentors who help online students and the support structures that are set up at local schools. Do you feel that this same reflection applies to this year's report? That's a good point. I think we came away saying from last year with the same kind of conclusion that we would have from this year, which is, even when courses are held fairly constant, even when you control for what's the substance of a course and who's the teacher behind that course, there is still wide performances gaps that we see based on the school. And if you recall a handful of slides ago, let me see if I can get back to it here. Okay, so this slide again is showing that there's a large percentage, close to 26, 28% of schools who have programs, virtual programs, that their kids are getting 90% or more, are passing 90% or more of the time. And they're likely similar programs to schools who are experiencing the 10 to 20s or the 20 to 30s. And the challenge is really, we get asked this kind of more simplistic question about, well, when is online learning right for a student? How do you know if this kid should be taking an online course? And maybe it's because I'm a strong proponent of online learning, but I look at it this way. I think 95%, a recent report from Pearson, the Babson group in higher ed, 95% of public colleges and universities were offering distance education courses and see that as being critical to the long-term success of their universities. You have over 5 million college-age kids who are taking online or distance education courses. We have more and more job opportunities for people to work remotely than we've seen before. You have professional development, such as this webinar that exists in a virtual medium. And the conclusion that we tend to draw is part of what it means to be college and career ready when you graduate high school means that you have the skill sets to be this kind of independent online and virtual learner. And if that's really the goal, and in our recent survey of those 800 Michigan adults, that goal really resonates. We had 80%, 79% I think it was, of the respondents who agreed or strongly agreed with knowing how to learn online is a core component of what it means to graduate college and career ready. Well, then we come to a different end goal. The question isn't, is this, should this kid or shouldn't the kid be in online learning? The question is the trajectory question. If I need to get this kid to graduate at the end of grade 12 being somewhat proficient in online and virtual learning, then we need to do some things to get them ready along the way. The Michigan Virtual University will be launching I think this week, a free tool, what we call OLOT. It's an online orientation tool, and its focus is to try to help local schools, counselors, mentors, parents, the students get a better understanding of what this online learning environment is like and what it will entail for them to be successful. And it has several different modules that students can go through. And the goal of it is to have mentors understand this process and be able to pick and choose based on their personalized knowledge of an individual to help get them supported. I think one of the lessons we see specifically in this is, as practitioners, or when it gets asked, what does this report mean in practice? I tell people, if you're a parent of a kid who's thinking about online learning, if you're a counselor or a building administrator who's thinking about having your kids get in online learning, I would tend to recommend a slower step for these students who are taking it supplemental. It is just as different for the 10-year veteran teacher who has been teaching face-to-face for 10 years, very experienced, is then asked to move into their online, and teach this course online. We wouldn't expect that teacher that first time through the course to be as effective as a teacher as they would be if they were in that face-to-face modality that they're so used to. And yet we don't often think about the same thing being true for that online student who is moving those modalities and what it means to be a good learner, to be a successful learner. Those traits and skills are different, and when we give them and pile up the number of courses, I think we're seeing bad results from some of those, and so this kind of slow stepping works. But coming back, Catherine, to your key issue is a lot of people in the school districts who are supposed to be the experts about these ideas are what, at least in the state of Michigan, are known as on-site mentors. You may see them in the literature in other states as a facilitator or a coach, a guide. They're known by different names, but any enrollment that's made through the public school system in a virtual course, they're required in Michigan to have this on-site helper. And what we've found, I think, to date is that sometimes these mentors are by name only. They don't see the kid very often. We've had data points from the virtual school in the past that says they didn't know I had a mentor at when we ask them at the end of the semester. And then you have really rich examples of other schools where they have several staff members whose full-time job it is to meet with students in the lab and monitor their work and see how they're doing and help them develop the skills that they're going to need. And we're trying to figure out how this message can be, sure, there's something that the virtual providers need to continue to improve in, but we have to work on every angle we can. And that local support program, training of these mentors. We're going to have a mentor portal that we're going to be pushing out this spring that tries to bring a community of practitioners together to learn from each other, to learn from the research that our institute is doing. Regardless of which provider they're using, whether it's the virtual school or some other third-party provider, it's just too important of a space right now. It's too important of a skill that our kids need to graduate with, and I fear we're not quite at where we need to be. Any other questions? Thanks for the kind words, Anne. You too, Eric.
Okay, great.
Well, Justin, I'll turn it over to you then.
Oh, yep. Thanks, Joe. If anyone does have a question, please submit it through the chat box, and we will have Joe get back on the mic and address your question or your comment. We just want to share a few more things before we wrap up today. we wanted to bring your attention to an event that MVLRI will be organizing and hosting, which is the Online and Blended Learning Research Community Meeting, which will take place as a pre-conference workshop to INACOL's Blended and Online Learning Symposium, November 8th through 11th, 2015 in Orlando, Florida this year. So if you have an interest in helping us plan that meeting, or you'd like to contribute to the meeting itself, please feel free to reach out to us by emailing us. We'll be sharing our email address pretty shortly here. We also wanted to point you to two of our other initiatives that we currently have ongoing. We have our Virtual Viewpoints podcast, which we use as a platform to amplify the voices of those who are actually using applicable research in their work and blended and online learning. So if you'd like to listen to the first episode, it is up there at the URL posted. We have a couple more episodes that will be posted very soon. We also have our guest blogger program. So if you're interested in writing for us, got some ideas, some research that you'd like to share through a blog format, please reach out to us. Check out the URL there to learn more about our guest blogger program. We do have another webinar scheduled for tomorrow where we'll be hosting Kristen Whitaker and Don Brummett from Spokane Virtual Learning in Spokane, Washington, and they'll be sharing some of the research that they've conducted, some of the findings that they've gathered as their district switches from online or makes a transition from online to blended learning. So be sure to join us tomorrow, February 18th at 2 p.m. Eastern to hear about their findings. And in the meantime, if you've got some feedback for us about our webinar process, our research, if you'd like to be a contributor to any of the projects that we have ongoing, or if you just would like to reach out to us to point us to something that you know of that's very important that we should maybe try and share with our audience, please feel free to reach out to us at mvlri@mivu.org. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter. Our handles are posted there, as well as our LinkedIn page. And check out our YouTube channel where we post the recordings of all of our webinars. And check out our webinars page there where you can see all of our upcoming webinars that we have currently scheduled. With that, I'll leave the chat window open for a little while longer. I hope everyone enjoys the rest of your Tuesday and hope to see a lot of you folks tomorrow for tomorrow's webinar. Take care.